Good afternoon, and welcome to the UCLA History Department's Why History Matters series. Today's event, Making a Difference, Historical Scholarship and Social Justice. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of the Division of Social Sciences. Today's conversation is notable for two reasons. The first is that this event was organized to honor the incredible legacy of Dr. Gary Nash, Professor of History, who recently passed. Gary was the embodiment of a community-engaged scholar, and his work is still revered for shaping the curriculum for K-12 education across the US. His work has been particularly impactful with respect to our understanding of how race and class have shaped society over the years. It stands as a model for the type of engaged scholarship we value here at UCLA in the social sciences. The second reason is today's conversation is moderated by Dr. Scott Waugh, who prominently served UCLA as Professor of History, Dean of Social Sciences, and until his retirement a few years ago, Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost for UCLA. We are delighted and honored to have Scott with us today to lead the discussion on this important topic. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Carla Pestana, Chair of the History Department.
Thank you, Dean Hunt. I'm Carla Pestana, Chair of the History Department at UCLA, and I am honored to welcome alumni, friends, and our community partners to the department's first Why History Matters event of the academic year. Thank you all for spending some time with us on Veterans Day to learn from experts as we navigate unprecedented times in our nation's history. The department is proud to be at the forefront of our national conversation about how we teach history, starting with K-12 education. Why History Matters is a series that brings together scholars and community leaders to discuss important issues in their historical and contemporary contexts. Tonight's discussion honors the late UCLA History Professor Emeritus, Gary Nash, who left an indelible legacy and made profound contributions to the teaching of history. Gary was my PhD advisor and mentor when I was a graduate student here at UCLA. As a founding director of UCLA's National Center for History in the Schools, where he worked for 20 years, Gary spearheaded efforts to diversify American history courses, and he championed the stories of groups who had been excluded from textbooks. While at UCLA, he co-directed the National History Standards Project, which included 4 years worth of input from teachers, historians, parents, and educators to propose a national history curriculum for US students. I am pleased to introduce our esteemed moderator, Scott Waugh, UCLA History Professor Emeritus, and notably UCLA's former Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, who will lead us in conversation with historian and distinguished UCLA history professor Robin Kelley, holder of the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in US History, Daniel Diaz, the director of the UCLA History Geography Project, and Kelly Lytle Hernandez, director of the UCLA Bunch Center for African American Studies, who also holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History. Take it away, Scott.
Welcome everybody to this session of History Matters that's exploring, as Darnell and Carla said, the legacy of Gary Nash, Professor of History at UCLA, that recently passed away. He really did have a tremendous legacy of scholarship, activism, teaching. He believed passionately that history mattered, and he devoted his energy to demonstrating that it matters. And he did that both inside and outside the university. He did it with fellow scholars, he did it with historians, but he also did it with teachers and students in the schools, as you've heard. Gary belonged to a generation of historians that were eager to overturn the standard historical narratives that had existed until then, based primarily on politics and institutions. Inspired by all kinds of theories, these historians aimed at telling history. I think the phrase at the time was from the bottom up, from the perspective of those who had been left out of standard historical narratives. And they wanted to overturn that. They wanted to rewrite it. And Gary was at the forefront, or one of the leaders at the forefront of that. History had long been deaf to the voices of the majority of the population, to women, to poor and working classes, to different ethnic groups, to the unfree, and to many elements of society that were not part of the ruling elite. For Gary, that meant that the history of colonial and revolutionary America had to be expanded to include not solely the white men who are responsible for developing American institutions, but of all the people who contributed to the development of the country in many, many different ways, and ways that were largely unknown to many people. Specifically, it meant listening to the stories of the African Americans, slave and free, Native Americans, and workers and apprentices. As perhaps Gary's most famous book, Red, White, and Black, shows, the history of the founding of the United States was much more complex and far richer than standard accounts would have it. He wanted to give agency to all those groups and demonstrate their agency and show that groups whose contributions had been overlooked mattered a great deal. And they mattered then, but they continue to matter to us now. And Gary did not want to restrict his understanding of history to inside the academy or just to scholarship. He wanted to change the way history was taught. He wanted to give students and teachers a sense of empowerment, that he wanted to expose them, if you will, or have them understand primary sources, to understand the role of interpretation, to understand how history was made, not just the content of history, but the actual process of history. And that was important because it helps demonstrate why history matters and why individuals who may feel they're not part of history do have a place. And that place is extremely important. And I think that sense of giving agency to people was really important to Gary and a very important part of his legacy. So a subsequent generation of historians has now built on, expanded and modified the work of our generation of scholars. And as in so many things, they've expanded and enriched it. Women's history, labor history, African-American history, Hispanic history, Native American history, all of these histories and many more, labor and employment history, all of these grew out of these initial steps that were taken in the 60s and 70s. The growth of this has not always been easy. It's not always been accepted by the academy. It's hard to overturn well-entrenched paradigms. But the history that these scholars has produced so far is richer than anything we imagined in the 60s. And history is far better off for it because it reaches and touches everyone. And it shows that history truly does matter. And it shows the myriad ways in which history matters, which is more important. We're really fortunate to have three brilliant practitioners of the modern history to expound on Gary's legacy and to explain what matters to historians and students and why this tradition matters to everyone. So thank you for joining us. And we're going to start off the panel discussion with Kelly Lytle Hernandez. Please, Kelly, take it away.
Thanks, Scott. Good evening, good afternoon, friends. It's really wonderful to be here today and to be in this conversation with Danny and Robin and Scott and others. I want to first begin by saying that we're here to honor Gary, to celebrate his work, and I personally owe a debt of gratitude to Gary. I wouldn't be at UCLA without him. When I was looking at graduate schools and where to go, I was admitted to UCLA, but without any scholarships or without any fellowships and couldn't afford to come. And it was Gary who gave me a job with the National Center for History in the Schools and made it possible for me to study at UCLA. So in many ways, my career really is indebted to Gary and his generosity and what he built at the National Center for History in the Schools. What I wanted to do today is talk briefly about some of the work that I've been doing, and I certainly feel inspired and encouraged to do by Gary's work, his life, and his legacy that marries historical scholarship with social and racial justice today. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story about what's going on in the country right now. As you probably know, there's been a major movement against mass incarceration in this country. And there's one segment of mass incarceration that we don't talk all that much about, and that's the federal penal system. The number one charge sending people into federal prison today is something called Section 1326. And what that does is it makes it a felony to re-enter the United States if you're an immigrant after deportation. It's a felony that people can be convicted on and sentenced up to 20 years behind bars prior to deportation. Roughly 1/3 of the people in the federal prison system today are there on a 1326 charge. And about 99% of those people are Latino. About 99% of them are male, and a disproportionate share of them are indigenous, peoples who have been displaced out of southern Mexico and Central America in particular. There's so many people being sent to prison today on a 1326 charge that US attorneys now prosecute people in these mass trials called streamlined trials, in which up to 70 people can be shackled and marched into a courtroom and their case tried all at the same time, and then they're marched off to prison. So this is one of the most significant and the racially disparate areas of mass incarceration today. We don't talk about it very much, but there are a group of federal defenders who are using history to try to dismantle what's happening at the intersection of mass incarceration and immigration control today. So let me explain what they're doing. Last year, a group of federal defenders in San Diego, led by a lawyer named Kara Hetzler, read the most recent book that I published called City of Inmates. And there's a chapter in that book, City of Inmates, that talks about where 1326 comes from. Who are the people who adopted and invented this law, and why did they invent it? And in this chapter, what I do is I take us back to the 1920s and talk about the rise of a whites preferred immigration system, in which Congress adopted a quota system to try to regulate the number of immigrants allowed to enter the United States, but also to winnow down the quality of immigrants to be just from Western and Northern Europe. They also categorically banned all Asian immigration, and they criminalized unauthorized border crossings as a measure to try to control the number of Mexican immigrants, namely indigenous immigrants and non-white immigrants who entered the country. And if they did enter the country, that they could be under another form of social control, which is the threat of arrest and imprisonment. So when Kara Hetzler and others read this chapter in this book, they realized that Section 1326, in fact, is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution, that it was adopted for explicitly racist purposes, for white supremacist purposes. And from its origin in 1929, up until its current incarnation today in our penal system, the outcomes are continuously racially disparate. And so they've been challenging this law across the country. They filed cases in San Diego, cases in Virginia, cases in Idaho, cases in Washington, cases US Virgin Islands, across the country, arguing that a law that was adopted for explicitly racist purposes and that continues to deliver racist outcomes violates the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution. They lost the cases in Virginia, in Idaho, Colorado, elsewhere, until this summer in July, where they won the case in Nevada. And there was a judge who read the history, read the statements of the congressmen, the eugenicists, the white supremacists, including Madison Grant, who talked about the need to end Mexican immigration as a need to purify the blood of the nation. And they said that this is wrong. What is happening on the border today is a continuation of what was begun in the 1920s. And she called an end to the enforcement of 1326 cases within her jurisdiction. So today, because of the truth of history and the power of history and the leveraging of history, no one in Nevada is going to be arrested and sent to prison for entering the country without authorization. Now, we continue the campaign, of course, immigrant advocates, scholars, and federal defenders. The goal now is to make sure that the Biden administration does not appeal the case in Nevada. And if we can get the Biden administration to back down, then no one across the country will go to prison for entering the United States without authorization after deportation. So this is one example of how history has empowered lawyers to go to bat for immigrants, for a disparaged community, and to attempt to dismantle a regime, an architecture that was created at a trying time in the 1920s with white supremacist purposes. So that's the example I wanted to share with everyone today as a jumping off point for our conversation that we'll have all together. I hand it off.
Thank you very much, Kelly. That's terrific. Danny, it's your turn.
Hey, thank you, Scott. And good evening, everyone. What's up? My name is Danny Diaz, and I'm the current director of the UCLA History Geography Project, which is one of the California History Social Science Project sites, or CHSSP. For those of you who don't know, CHSSP was founded here at UCLA in, I believe, 1998. I met Gary Nash in 1999 or 2000 when I was finishing up my undergrad at Whittier College. My professor then was Laura McEnany, and Gary wanted to visit her class of seniors to just engage in some Q&A. I don't know if he was collecting data, but he asked us some very interesting questions about what we think the purpose of history is, what our experience was learning about history in high school, why we're history majors, and what we plan to do with all of this knowledge and this skill set that we've accumulated over our 4 years in college. And that was one of the moments where I realized that I think I want to be a teacher. And so from the jump, Gary was pretty instrumental in my life. I began teaching in 2002. I taught for 13 years, K-12, high school history, world and US history. I taught in Boyle Heights at Roosevelt High School, and then in Pico Rivera at El Rancho High School. During that time, I was really inspired by historians like Gary, like Howard Zinn, like the historians that would tell the stories of everyday people. I believe that history is important. It matters because it's the very foundation of sort of understanding the roots. At its very foundation, it helps us understand the roots of the moment, of the current context. And I always try to instill that in the students that I taught when I was a high school teacher. Not to say that I don't enjoy learning about like ancient history and teaching early modern history, but I find history especially empowering when it helps me make sense of myself, my family, my community, our nation and its people. As a teacher, I constantly ask myself, how can I inspire my students today? How can I help them develop critical thinking skills? I had Gary Nash's History Matters blue book on my desk for the 13 years that I was a teacher, and I'd flip through it at the end of the week, just looking for ideas for lessons, concepts. He had some great primary sources in there. And so that was instrumental. He was kind of with me throughout those 13 years. As the director of the History Project, I approach my work with similarly large questions in mind. Things that I thought about while I was teaching high school, and questions they're really big, like what does it mean to teach history while living in an empire? What does it mean to be a teacher living in a society that is diverse and ever-changing? What does it mean to teach history in a nation that has yet to reconcile its past, right? So the legacy that Gary leaves is that is kind of the foundation of the work that I do now in training and supporting teachers. One of the things that I see Gary's imprint is this desire that my project and the other history projects in the state of California have to build what we call a K-16 continuum. That is, how can we bridge history educators in K-12 with our scholars at higher education so that we see each other as peers and equals, that we can learn from one another. And the other thing that I focus my work on is helping history teachers shift from more traditional ways of teaching history. Gary critiqued the hyper focus on memorization and the sort of great man approach to history, and the sort of debates that he and Liz Cheney had in the 90s when the standards were being drafted. And this is no easy task to get history teachers to shift, but there is so much movement that has happened from the 90s to now. We're now seeing primary sources included in classrooms. Teachers are introducing inquiry questions to drive lessons. This is all building on the work that historians like Gary laid the foundation for. And it inspires the work that I do. I've asked Dr. Lytle Hernandez to do a keynote at a teaching history conference where she talked about settler colonialism, which is a new concept to most of our US history teachers in K-12. I've asked Ron Malor, who I'm guessing is on one of the members or attendees at this panel discussion today, to drive down to Compton Unified to give a talk to a small room of 6th grade teachers and other historians like Kevin Teresiano to do the same. So this kind of work is really inspired by Gary Nash. And I'm continually inspired by his work and the work of Dr. Lytle Hernandez and Dr. Kelly and other historians that continually center the lives and experiences and counter narratives of folks that have not seen the time of day or had stories recorded in textbooks. And in my work, that empowers students to learn from the past and know that they can resist, persist, find moments of joy, and make change in their communities.
Thank you, Danny. That's wonderful. I think schools need that kind of enthusiasm and support more than ever these days, but that's terrific. Robin Kelly, please,
Yes.
the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Scott. It's really great and inspiring to be with all of you whose work I admire, and to spend this time thinking about Gary Nash. It's funny to hear Danny talk about 90s till now. I mean, I started graduate school at UCLA in 1983. So I think about the 80s or even the 70s to now. And one of the basic facts, in thinking about Gary's legacy and work and how it connects to the work that I do, one basic fact is that for some fields of history, that is to say anything having to do with racism, genocide, Black, Brown, Asian Pacific or Indigenous people, socialists and communists, workers' rebellions, gender, sexuality, feminist and queer movements have always been at war. In other words, there was no kind of ebb and flow of the history of wars. I entered graduate school and left it in a state of war, and that's what it means to do this work. I came up doing African-American labor history and radical histories simultaneously. So attacks, come with the territory. And especially if you insist, as Gary had done, that all those movements, all those histories fall squarely within the category of US history. In other words, they're not these separate little entities and fiefdoms, and then the US is the major thing. It's all in there. And Gary understood that. So I bet he wasn't that surprised by the backlash he got with the history standards. Nevertheless, like so many of us, I've spent the last 3 decades plus, writing my share of public-facing articles, op-eds, work with the American Social History Project based in New York, which was try to shape public school curricula. I had my hand in writing a kind of a textbook, an 11-volume history of African Americans for young readers for Oxford University that I work with my friend Earl Lewis. And we assembled a great group of scholars. And this is in the early 90s. This is like right around the moment when Charlotte Crabtree and Ross Dunn, and of course, Gary, were under attack by Liz Cheney, but our series went nowhere. For the same reason that the history standards were being attacked, for the same reason that the 1619 Project is being attacked, for the same reason that any text that critically frames history through the lens of race or gender, sexuality, or class for that matter, is being attacked, all in the name of something that's being called critical race theory, which has nothing to do with critical race theory. It's just simply the same old story, the same old attacks. Why that's the case, part of it's because this work disrupts the ruling narrative of the US as a perfect union. And we're also told that it makes white people uncomfortable. Why it does is baffling to me, and we could talk about that maybe in our conversation. Meanwhile, less than a year after Lynn Cheney declared war on Gary Nash and the history standards, Dinesh D'Souza published his national bestseller, End of Racism, which was considered a kind of work of history. But what were the main bullet points? Slavery was a sane, rational system that actually made life better for Africans fortunate enough to be enslaved. In his words, quote, slavery proved to be the transmission belt that nevertheless brought Africans into the orbit of modern civilization and Western freedom. He argues that those who held others in bondage, not the enslaved, should be compensated for the loss of property. He argued that Black poverty and quote unquote intellectual underachievement is a product of a long, uncivilized, hedonistic, violent culture. He recast the 1964 Civil Rights Act as a racist law that perpetuates discrimination against white people. And, we may say this is so ridiculous, this is, just absurd, but these same narratives continue to be reproduced, certainly by figures like Ann Coulter and Glenn Beck and Paul Kengor and others, all in the name of correcting history, of anti-revisionist history. So having said that, much of my own teaching and trying to shape the kind of discourse around, how to teach and understand history actually takes place outside of the academy itself. I really appreciated Kelly's work with these attorneys. I mean, for me, a lot of my own teaching outside of the academy is directed at social movements committed to changing the world. So I've done workshops with Domestic Workers United, Excluded Workers Congress, Labor Community Strategy Center, the Black Radical Congress, the Coalition of Black Trade Unions, the Children's Defense Fund, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Movement for Black Lives, Law for Black Lives, lots of different, labor unions, labor centers, community youth centers. I mean, I've been doing this for 35 years. And contrary to what we think, that kind of history education is not preaching to the choir. On the contrary, activists actually want to understand what they're up against. So I talk a lot about racial capitalism, for example, as they ask me to. They know that movements came before them. They want to know the history of those movements, the mistakes they made, the context in which they emerged. And above all, activists, organizers, movements, they are looking for a mixture of different kinds of guidance and confidence in the power of people organized to make change. And yet we still subscribe to a kind of version of a great man theory of history, in 2021. Even today, the New Deal welfare state is seen as the doings of President Roosevelt, not the militant labor movement and the unemployed. Lyndon Johnson is the hero in the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, in Medicare and Medicaid, not thousands of social movements in the streets or in the countryside. Reagan ended the Cold War, not insurgencies in Eastern Bloc countries or the disarmament movement in the US, that's pushing back against US Cold War policy. So part of this struggle to sort of revise history isn't just about inclusion, it's about changing our perspective and seeing where the momentum is. Scott was so on when he talks about agency. That agency is not just agency to give people dignity, but agency in terms of what's the motive force of history, what makes change. One last remark I want to say, finally, just to conclude, and that is history matters right now and lives are at stake in a way that we don't always think about. Kyle Rittenhouse, showed up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, armed because he embraced a particular historical narrative shaped by alt-right websites, shaped by Blue Lives Matter rhetoric. And he will be set free, I almost guarantee it, because we've inherited a narrative that our criminal justice system is the best in the world, a product of big brains and big hearts of our founding fathers, that white settlers, the police, even white vigilantes meting out popular justice have always been the good guys, fighting the bad guys. The bad guys could be Indians. The bad guys could be outlaws. The bad guys, of course, are Black people who are criminally prone, just as Muslims are natural terrorists. These narratives, maybe at the high echelons of the university may not be the dominant ones, but this is what's driving a lot of thinking. And even though Rittenhouse killed 2 white men, they were on the side of the looters and rioters, as the judge would suggest. I mean, the judge in this case would not permit those men he killed to be called victims, but only looters and rioters. So in closing, I know this book, History on Trial, which I read all the time, ends on a rather sanguine note. That work continues in spite of the government failure or cowardice. But I fear that this current moment we're in, these current attacks on history are even more extremist and more popular than they were 25 years ago. So I'd love to have a conversation about some of this stuff.
Thank you, Robin. All three of you have raised a host of really important and very interesting questions. And we'd like to hear from the audience if they have any questions, but I'd just like to pose one thing that I think all three of you have sort of highlighted the fact that history is, in a sense, under attack. Real history is under attack all across the country and all across different classes. And the question is, obviously you feel a responsibility for correcting that, as Gary did, to reach out beyond the walls of the university to show people that history is not what they think it is, that it's much, much more complex and much more important. What other things should the university be doing, or should professors be doing in order to try and make that a reality? And it can't happen overnight, but how do you re-engineer the historical viewpoints? Thank you for those quick answers. We'll move on now to.
No, I can talk a bit about this because I have feet in both higher ed and in K-12. So I am a practitioner. I go in and I work with teachers directly. So one of the things that I find teachers struggle with as we're trying to shift away from more traditional narratives is what they're telling me is lack of resources, and also, like, I read into that, lack of information, right? So I'm talking more about our veteran teaching force, folks who have been in the classroom 15 plus years. They're using textbooks that are 20 years old based on the standards from 1998, right? Those are outdated standards, and we have a new framework in the state of California that's attempting to update all of that. So, like, that's one struggle. The other thing that that we hear a lot, and I heard a lot when I was a teacher, and I still hear this day, is this kind of idea of the message to students in K-12 is, when you get to college, you need to learn how to take notes. You need to learn how to memorize. Your professors are going to require you to do blue book writing, kind of things, and you need to understand this stuff. So I'm going to teach you to get you ready for that. But then when I talk to historians, they say, hey, the students aren't coming to us with the kind of skills that are needed to, to think critically and to make some arguments. And so I sort of see a disconnect there as well. So one of the things that I recommend is, one, updating the teacher education module, which UCLA is doing a great job at, for teachers who want to do history teaching in K-12, so that it's more rigorous, it's inquiry driven, and that it provides access to unique and different histories. And then the piece that I think scholars can do is collaborate more with local organizations that are doing history education, right? Even like Dr. Lytle Hernandez doing talks, providing primary documents, things like that. If you all ever want to collaborate to introduce counter narratives and things like that, you just let me know, because our teachers really love that. And then we hear back, oh my God, the students found this lesson really engaging. More, please. So those are sort of some of the things that I'm recommending that can be done to start making more of this shift.
Right. No, I would totally agree with that. In fact, I don't even know what a blue book looks like, by the way. I've never used blue books in anything. But I do know that there's got to be greater conversation, collaboration. A lot of us, in fact, I know Kelly has done it, and I've done it. Many people in our department's done it. Done these sort of NEH workshops with teachers. But this is not like, to me, the concern that you raised, Scott, isn't so much of what's happening in our classrooms, or for that matter, even in classrooms at really good public schools. I mean, a lot of it is that there's a populist movement that's waging war on what teachers can do. And so the threat of being fired, on top of the imposition not of standards, but of standardized testing, as a way to really limit creative thinking. I have great students. My freshmen are terrific. And I wouldn't even make the argument that they're not prepared. They're not prepared for my class because they're not used to doing things like collaborating with each other. They're not used to thinking of history as contested terrain. They're used to thinking very differently, but they're prepared and open to open up the debate. And again, to go back to Gary, to Gary, Charlotte, and Ross's book, they end by saying, the most important thing we can do in a democracy is to democratize history. That is to say, instead of shutting down the conversation to try to impose an official story, we fight it out publicly. And the more publicly we can do that, which doesn't happen on MSNBC or any of these television shows, but the more publicly we can do that, the more we can open up a discussion of not what is the right narrative, but how to think about the past.
Yeah, I want to emphasize what Robin just said there about the contested nature of history and the terrain in which we fight it out, right? So it's not always on MSNBC, although it certainly happens there, but it happens in K-12 classrooms, it happens at the dinner table. And when we fight it out, for me, that makes me think about, it's really important that we stop conceptualizing historical narrative development is being created at the institution of the university. It's actually being created everywhere, and that fight is everywhere, that terrain is everywhere. And I think that makes it really important for us as scholars rooted in the university to think about our methodology and who we partner with to tell stories, to do research. There are perspectives that are out there, especially from whatever issue we're talking about, most impacted communities, that have to be brought to the center of the analysis and to the center of the storytelling. And it's very difficult to do that from the heart of the university. So when you ask Scott, like, what do we need to do with the university, right? And that's how I heard that question, right? Maybe that's not how you meant it, but that's how I heard it. I think we need to think about the ways in which we quantify and acknowledge and embrace and support and defend scholarship that's done in partnership with communities that are in struggle, right? And so what does that look like at the university? I'm going to assume that many people out there are connected with the university. It means that we're not just publishing in peer-reviewed academic journals, right? That part of the review is happening at the community level in terms of, yes, the rigor of the research, but what is a story that empowers us to engage in social movements? And both of those things matter greatly. So at the university, I would encourage us to look at our criteria for tenure, our criteria for promotion, and make sure that there is additional space for this kind of what's called community engaged, but really politically driven, community engaged work that centers perspectives and partnerships that are beyond the university.
Yeah, I think all those points are very well taken. And I think, we live in a time when the terrain of history is hyper contested. Of course, everything is hyper contested. I was, Kelly, to answer your question, I was trying to figure out what should we do in the university. Gary was an optimist. He felt that through engagement and working with teachers and students and working in other community activities, the kinds of things that Kelly and Robin have done, that in the long run would have some effect. That he believed very strongly in the kind of history that he practiced and that others practiced, and wanted to make sure that had not just a foothold, but it had a way of seeping outward into the broader culture. And personally, I despair of reading the paper these days, but I do think that if history is going to matter, it's only going to start with our engagement and our demonstration that it matters by showing that the people, listening to the people who are doing history, living history, and then showing that matters. I think, which is what all three of you have suggested in one way or another. What else? If you think about sort of this contested terrain, it is a populist movement, and it's a populist movement, ironically, that is also very elitist. And it comes out of some institutions and is reified in some institutions. And I don't know how you think about that or what you think about the ways in which you can change those kinds of institutions. It's not just a matter of showing what the real history is, but it's also engaging in some way. And I don't know whether you have a sense of optimism, Robin, about that at all, or that it's not worth engaging in.
Well, I always have optimism in people's movements. And I think, Kelly's absolutely right that, if all the professional historians disappeared right now, it's not as if there wouldn't be a struggle over history and a really informed one. So much of what a lot of us learn from people involved in social movements who have a perspective that's not just on the present, but on the past. And one of the things that's really kind of upsetting is the media's fascination with this obsession with, well, two things. The media's obsession with the attacks on history as being kind of like backwater attacks, the tendency to reduce the fault lines to like who won the Civil War, as if, this is only about a North-South divide. And, you could even read History on Trial where they give examples of struggles in places like Meriden, Connecticut, where there's a fight over the curriculum, fight over textbooks. And any textbook that has things about labor struggles or anything about social equality or about, women would be considered persona non grata. But the other thing which I think is worrisome is the way that we have inherited these ideas of expertise. And the idea of expertise is what I was trying to get to when I said, like, the great man in history story actually redounds to our methodology, to the way we even think about who we should look to for to write this history. So one of the great examples, counterexamples, is in Detroit, where so many great things are happening in Detroit right now, where groups like the East Side Solutionaries are producing their own histories, where you can go work on an organic farm in the middle of the city that was created out of abandoned territory. And within that farm, like the Feed and Freedom growers, you could go in the house and take, and study history and politics and learn about the kind of social crisis that people are facing. And Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit always had this vision of freedom schools. And so freedom schools are popping up all over the place, in which history is not something that's taught to them, but something that they actually go out and make. They go out and interview people. They go out and sort of create murals and projects that are trying to document and memorialize struggles for justice. And they say, we're biased. Our bias is that we want a just society, and that's the history that matters to us the most. So I think all this work is being done, but it never gets any media attention compared to the craziness that we're seeing where people's lives are being threatened.
Well, I
Want to add to that, Danny?
I can't add to that, but I can add my own perspective. I think the moment that we're currently in. Sorry about that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think the moment that we're currently in informs us about the problematic nature of the way that that history has been taught. I don't want to say that history has been taught and how it's been valued or undervalued. This was like a running joke on one of the late night shows in the 90s, right? Where they would go out in the street and they would interview people and they would ask them like sort of like basic history questions. And the fact that like those people would give answers that were nowhere close to the answer was like, fodder for laughter and things like that. And it's like, yeah, the information is one thing, memorizing facts is one thing, but there's also a like skill set, right? A set of like some conceptual thinking that lends itself to developing like a critical consciousness, a criticality, and that has been largely missing from the way that history has been taught. And I would argue that having a critical consciousness or a healthy amount of skepticism and a skill set to be able to do that is like the first defense against the rise of like fascism and threats to democracy. But because we have valued, and this is what Gary was critiquing, freedom quest narratives and memorization over this kind of debate and argument, and looking at evidence and then localizing and thinking about your own histories, we've prioritized the latter. I believe is part of the reason why we find ourselves in this scenario that we're in. And that really fuels a lot of the work that we do at the History Project.
That's good.
And I think I would only add, there's many things that keep me optimistic. I think I was born an optimist, so that helps, right? But there's many things in what we do every day that fuel that. And it's often that moment when you are with a student that when they learn some content and they begin to grapple with this terrain that we've been talking about, that you can watch them pivot and their world open up. And let me explain, like recently, something that happened just last week. I work in one of the fields I work in is Mexican American history. And that is so poorly represented in the textbooks. If you go and you take, give folks a quiz on Mexican American history, they'll definitely fail it across the board. It's just a field that people know very, very little about in the general public, unfortunately. And I was in a conversation with a 40-something-year-old Chicano from East LA who had been through the prison system, the LA County jail system, had graduated from Homeboy Industries here, has gone on to have a very successful career as an actor, but had carried his whole life a feeling of shame that what had occurred in his life and in his family's life was there was something wrong with him and there was something wrong with his family. And when we began to talk about Mexican American history and the criminalization of immigrants and the criminalization of populations and in specific terms, he saw how it lined up with his own family history. And you literally watched his shoulders settle down as the burden came off of him. And he said, it's not me. It was a trap that's been set up across history that my family and everyone that lives in my neighborhood was caught up in. And he is now on fire, right, about history and learning more history, engaging in history, telling history, and I've been able to watch him narrate the story. And he's got his own twists and his own turns and mobilize communities around the histories of the criminalization of Latinx immigrants in particular. And that's the moment that keeps me really, really optimistic when people all get on fire around history, that it really helps to reset their own sense of self and their own sense of power in this world and what they can do and what they can change. And then you begin to work, right, and organize with other people. And that, I think, is what Robin was talking about. When we organize in a community, then we can take on those structures and move toward dismantling the things that have harmed our families. So that keeps me really optimistic. It doesn't happen all that, it's not every day, but when it happens, it is, it fills me up, right? And can send us back into the archive, that long, slow slog of work of, as we all know, trying our best to collect up the story and pull it together and tell something that's meaningful.
Yeah, I think teaching can be incredibly energizing, precisely on those occasions, especially on those occasions when you do see that sense of turning and understanding where it's meaningful inside. And I wonder for all of you, Kelly, you raised the issue for one person, one example, but how do the students react today to inside the academy? Admitting with Robin that this is a selected or small and narrow group, given all of the currents in the country today. But nevertheless, it's an interesting group of people. And how are they responding to history? Because they're living in a time of incredible tension and change, obviously on an individual level, as Kelly has just said, but on a group level in every way. And how do they see? I mean, how do they see the history that you're teaching, instructing, and the approach that you have? I mean, Kelly has shown that it demonstrated that it can work and work very well. But in general, how are the students?
I'll jump in. So I teach a course, a huge lecture course. I got 360 students on neoliberalism. And it's basically looking at ideas, movements, and structures of capitalism from really, we go back to liberalism actually, to the 18th century. We're really focused on the late 20th and early 21st century. And it's a course where, the reading's intense, and these are mostly freshmen and sophomore, like first and second year students. And these students are on fire, I have to say. A lot of them are coming out of situations where many have been activists in high school around climate change and climate justice. There are students who are interested in the global South. There are students who actually come from the global South and come not in order to become just like another rich, their image of the rich American, but to really kind of change things globally. And the course itself is global. So those students are on fire. And their response to everything certainly, makes me enthusiastic, despite the fact that so much of the narrative is really pessimistic. It's really, about sweatshop labor in the 21st century and about, the climate catastrophe and other things. But one of the things that I really encourage them to do is change the culture of the classroom so that we have neoliberal classrooms that are designed around competition, around getting a grade, around, keeping your information to yourself so you can do well. And I'm like, help each other, work together, read each other's midterms, give each other help. If someone didn't read something, help them with the answer. Like they're like, you can't do that. It's, of course you can do that. Because the idea is that you're learning together, as all 360 of you learning together. So what sense does it make for you to be in a class and you watch somebody fail? You watch them struggle. You're seeing them and you're saying, well, good, more A's for me. If that's not how the world's gonna work. I mean, that may be how the neoliberal world works, but we can actually model a different kind of world. And the students are fantastic. I love this class, and they, in some ways, realize that there is a relationship between the movements that they came out of, the movements that they were reading about, and actually how things change. So neoliberalism doesn't have to be simply a structure that's beyond their power, but a product of a response to capital's crisis and the movement that demands a kind of welfare state in a different social order. And the question is, who's going to win? So I love my class.
That does count as optimism. I think that if you can engage the students and that they can come away with that with a sense, that's where, if they can come away with a sense that history matters to them in some way, that all of this, that they can transform it or transmute it inside themselves into something that's important and link it to what they see as their lives and their futures, after all. And that's really critical. And I think that's always what Gary had in mind. You just wanted students to make that kind of connection in a way that was meaningful for their lives and their futures and what they were doing, and not simply be a product of, as you've all said, memorization and learning and grades and getting by with it. And that's very limited in its appeal. And Danny, the students you have, do they have a similar sense of the meaningfulness of history, or that it matters to them?
Yeah, I think so. Teaching in K-12 is a different experience. You got 6 periods of 40 plus students and diverse diversity within those students. I mean, I know that that's not foreign to Dr. Kelly and Lytle Hernandez, but I think the best days were similar days that were described, where my students, the bell would ring, and sometimes students want to get out of the class, most times, like, let's be real. But when I would see like debates extend, after the bell rang, when I would have students come to me and say, hey, thank you, that was like one of my favorite classes. That was like really it. And the other part of it is just that it's the relationship part that I think that Dr. Lytle Hernandez and Dr. Kelly both have with their students, right? Just seeing them, treating them as adults, as people to be respected, showing that you love and care about them. That was also vital in the classrooms that I taught. That was also making my students more open to learning about history, and then just trying to be creative and engaging and centering stories of people that had similar experiences, helping students learn about themselves. That's when history becomes powerful, right? Is when you see yourself in the narrative. Right, we all want to be seen. That's what Brene Brown taught me. We all want to be seen and heard, and a history class can accomplish that. It worked for me. It changed my life when I met Susan Butler at Cerritos College, and when I met Laura McInerney and Gary Nash. Changed my life when I learned about the stories of people that look like me, where I understood how my family, who has been here as Mexican immigrants for 100 years, when I started to learn about what that experiences was like, was super empowering and informative, and it gave me a sense, it gave me a foundation of, this is who I am, this is why I am who I am, this is why my family is who they are, to some extent, is empowering. And we hear the same now in K-12 classrooms. We're talking about critical race theory and not teaching race, but what we hear overwhelmingly from students is that they're ready. It's not the students that aren't ready or who are feeling sensitive one way or another about this. It's really the some of the adults that are, yelling at one another about this. The students are ready. You can see it in the social movements that are happening, being led by young folks. Students are ready, and I think that they want more of what Gary was offering. So yeah.
Kelly, do you want to add anything, or?
No, I think the only thing I would add just to end here is, the most riveting history lecture I ever saw was a lecture that Gary gave at the lab school with about 20 K through 12 teachers. And he was talking about the American Revolution and the people who were sent to fight it, and how when the fighting was over, they were told that they had to find their own way home and walk home, right? Wherever they were, they had to walk home, and they'd been given endless promises. So it was about how the powerful can start a war, but the discouraged will have to fight it, right? And it was riveting. And he talked to every individual teacher, and you could watch them being transformed and empowered and fired up and ready to fight in that 20 minutes that he was speaking with them. And I think, Danny, it's what you were saying. They also felt the love, right, that he had for them, and that he had for the historical subjects, and they had for the material. And it was really in that moment that I feel like I learned how to be a historian, which is how to be a storyteller, how to center the experiences of people who have been disparaged, and how to make sure history is something that can be deployed as a tool for social and racial justice. And so we'll be forever grateful to Gary for teaching me that in that moment.
That's a lovely statement. I want to thank you all. I think this has been a really wonderful conversation, and it's been very important for me personally. I really enjoyed listening to you. A long time ago, before I lost my mind and went into administration, I worked on the California History Social Science Project and worked with teachers. And I worked with Gary and Charlotte on developing the standards, and also on some of Gary's textbooks. And I loved working with Gary, and for all of the reasons that you have highlighted. And I think you all, it's been very inspiring listening to you talk. It's been a long time since I've been in the classroom. I think you're great teachers, just from what you've said here. I'm deeply honored to be part of this conversation, and I want to thank you all for making I think a really wonderful presentation and a conversation. So, and it's, I think, a great way to honor Gary's legacy. You've done a tremendous job. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Scott. We really appreciate your leadership. and everyone else.
Good.
Danny,
Well, thank
Kelly.
you.